well, so.
Oh, I see David here.
Yeah, he already showed up, I guess.
Good
Yeah,
morning, everybody.
there you are, there you are.
It's very quiet out there, so that must mean it's time to begin. Welcome, and again, thank you to Forrest and to Monty Murdoch, Butler, and I'm trying to see if he's here yet. I don't see him, but when he comes on board, we'll make him a co-host as well.
Yeah,
And that's exceedingly helpful.
yeah.
We have Dr. Bruinsma again today, and we're going to begin our question and answer period with remarks from those we did not get a chance to hear from last time. Forrest, do you have before you that list of people?
I have before me those names and those who sent me on their my Zelle account, the extra money. No,
Okay, how many do we have?
I've got 4, Danilo, Eduardo, Peter, and I had Jeff come up on there again, so.
Okay, and then we want to get others involved. Let's keep the questions down to a minute or two and the responses about that long. And then maybe one follow-up. So we need to keep moving to get as many people involved as we can. Next week, Matthew Cortman will be with us on meta-modernism, M-E-T-A, meta-modernism, which is a step beyond postmodernism, I gather. I haven't read anything about it, so I'm looking forward to hearing what Matthew has to say. The week after that, on December 12th, we will have Norma Nashad with us, and she has this book, and it is titled, what? Norma Beyond the Tears. And this is from her endeavor called Rescue a Child. This is a very important philanthropic effort that Norma has developed. She used to be in the Loma area, then she was in the Washington, D.C. area, I think at the General Conference, and now is in Florida, where she is full-time on this. And I have asked her to come and share with us her work because it is amazing what she is doing. Her own life story is quite chilling, actually, but she has transformed her own heartaches into an ability to help other children who have had a very, very difficult time. Ed Turner, my friend from graduate school days, is the director of development for this endeavor, and he is a regular member of our Sabbath school, and we are glad that he will be with us again next week. I presume, I hope that's the case.
Yeah, just a little correction, Dave. It's restore a child, not rescue.
What did I say? Whatever I said, it's restore a child.
Yeah.
Okay, so now William Johnson, whom we know, wrote this book about Norma, and it is quite fascinating. It's not happy at the beginning. I must say, her childhood was not one that you would want to have, but it's one worth reading because she transformed all that heartache into something good for other people. Ed, do you want to say anything about this before we move on?
No, except that I've known Norma for about 3.5, 4 years. I had pretty well retired, and a mutual friend introduced us, and here she was by herself working in her house, her condominium. And from that position over 20 years, she's now currently working in 10 countries and has rescued or brought hope to over 4,000 orphans and neglected children worldwide. So it's quite a compelling story. And Bill Johnson did a great job in writing the book. And by the way, your sister university at La Sierra, Rodney Vance, who many of you know, they're producing a documentary film on her life. So we look forward to sharing with you on the 12th.
Okay, that's December 12. And I have more than one reason in asking Norma to share with us. On the one hand, I think it's a very important project to which many of you might individually want to contribute. But I think it would be helpful if the Roy Branson Sabbath School class made a contribution to the group as a class, to that endeavor as a class. We've done that in the past sometimes, and I think it would be helpful to do so in the future. We will have a business meeting as such on December 5, and we'll talk about this and other things. I do think that it's a good idea for outfits like ours to tithe. Not only people, but I think organizations should tithe and help those who are less fortunate. You have been very generous to the Sabbath School, and I think we should share some of that bounty with other people. So,
Let me just say one more thing, David.
yes,
100% of the monies that are donated for children, 100% goes to the children. We have other sources for operational funds. So, as you know, that's pretty well unheard of in the charity business. And Charity Navigator just came out with their score on the charity, which is 100 over 100. So we'll say more about that on the 12th.
I've never heard of anything like that. Forrest, you're an expert in this. Would you like to say anything about?
Well, expert, I'm not sure expert is a good word, but there are some organizations. When I worked for the American Bible Society, we did give 100% for about 4 years because we had other resources. But as said, it's very rare to have 100% to go to the charity. So.
Okay, so I just lost you because something happened.
Yeah, I'm done. There.
There we go. Thank you so much. Okay, here we go. Let's get started. This is from Matthew 23, a very familiar passage, but we must say before we begin it that what Jesus says applies to some, not all of the scribes and Pharisees. We have to be much more clear about that than our forefathers and foremothers were, and even the biblical writers were, because these words have been used to build up animosity, which became murderous against Jewish people. Now, common sense means that this could not possibly have referred to all the scribes and Pharisees, but also more historical research by people like E.P. Sanders has shown that the view that we often have of scribes and Pharisees is unduly negative. Sometimes we need to understand that a passage may need to be treated differently because of where we are in history than might have been done earlier. So let's keep that in mind. Having said all that, this is pretty strong stuff and we ought to take it into account. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. You blind guides, you strain out the gnat but swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup of the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup so that the outside also may become clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but inside they are full of the bones of the dead and of all kinds of filth. So you also on the outside look righteous to others, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. And it goes on and on like that. It's not particularly happy. But at the very end, these are the words that Matthew tells us Jesus said, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you are not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. So let's pray. Dear God, we know that the church is the body of Christ. And we know that this body has never been fully healthy. not in the past, not in the present, not in the future. It always needs nourishment, it always needs rest, it always needs exercise, but sometimes it needs surgery and radiation and chemotherapy. That's really, really rough because so much collateral damage there can be. Help us to be really wise as we think about deconstruction and perhaps reconstruction in the church today. In Christ's name, amen. Dr. Bruinsma.
Yes.
Did you want us to do the question and answer first, David?
No, I would prefer that if it's okay with everybody else, my first choice would be that we put the questions and answers at the outset of the time after the break and go into Dr. Bruinsma's presentation now. If that's agreeable, if anyone has a big objection to that, let's see your hand. Okay, I've got one thumbs up. Let's go forward.
It sounds good to me. So let me try to get the PowerPoint. It's good to be with the group again. And it's been good this past 4 weeks, this fifth presentation. And although this is going to be the last for the time being, who knows, I might be back sometime if the pandemic lasts long enough.
Yes.
Well,
right.
we go to the PowerPoint for today. Let's see whether I can bring it on the screen. There's always a little problem there. Even kijken. Just a little patience. Where is it now? Okay.
Okay. You can make us visible. I got my hair done and she's waving.
Oh my God. Oh, it's done.
Just
It's strange. What is that? What is that?
Jesus. She needs to turn her mic
Is
on.
that stuff done?
It is, it's not.
Oh, yes, it is.
I'm trying. Let me see. I don't know what I did.
Something's a little different this morning. We had a lot of trouble getting in. I'm not sure exactly what the problem was, but there we go.
Is it on the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry it took so long.
No problem.
I thought I was going to master this sometime, but apparently. Anyway, what
We're in no rush. No problem.
would Jesus deconstruct? That is the topic for tonight. No, this morning, sorry. No, it's dark outside, so I have the tendency to speak of tonight, but I realized that the sun is up in California and that probably it's nice and shining and about 30 degrees centigrade. Well, deconstruction.
Pretty warm.
I have
No.
two definitions here that are basically the same. One is positive and the other is
In the
negative.
80s.
90s.
In the 80s.
The first one, deconstructionism, is a challenge to the attempt to establish any ultimate or secure meaning in a text. Well, turn it around. In the second definition, deconstruction is
One second, Reinder, can you hear me? I muted you. I was trying to mute everybody so we wouldn't get so much background noise. And in the process of muting everybody, I muted you. So you need to unmute yourself at my error and perhaps back up a paragraph or two.
okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Then I'll go. Okay. So I was saying that we were going to talk about deconstruction, and that it's good to begin with a definition. And on the screen, I have, in fact, two definitions, but they're basically saying the same thing. One puts it in a negative way, and the second one puts it in a positive way. The first one says that deconstructionism is a challenge. That is to say, it's against the attempt to establish any ultimate or secure meaning in a text. As the second one says, it's defined as a way of analyzing literature that assumes that texts cannot have a fixed meaning. That is important to keep in mind. And it's also important then to keep in mind that the word text is often used quite broadly, even including more than written texts. Deconstruction, another definition, involves demystifying a text to reveal internal arbitrary hierarchies and presuppositions. By examining the margins of a text, the effort of deconstruction examines what it represses, what it doesn't say, and its incongruities. Deconstruction does not resolve these inconsistencies, but rather exposes hierarchies involved for distillation of information. So it tells us deconstruction goes behind the text, it analyzes the text, it tries to find out not just what it says, but also what it doesn't say. And the kind of presuppositions are there, the kind of bias is there, and even sometimes the power play that is in the text. The person who became most famous for the concept of deconstruction was the Frenchman Jacques Derrida. And we mentioned his name several times. Among the pioneers of postmodernism, these French authors, all of them are now dead, which means that they cannot write any more difficult books, which, you know, is a small blessing that we should be grateful for. Derrida, he was a Frenchman, yes, but he was a Jew, and what they call a pied noir, that is a Frenchman with black feet, that is a Frenchman who was born in Algeria, that being a French colony at the time. Jacques Derrida is a post-structuralist, and I propose that we do not go too much in the issues around structuralism and post-structuralism. The structuralists, just in one sentence, are the ones who see a basic structure behind the phenomena that they explore, whereas the post-structuralist says there are no such basic structures that hold things together. Deconstruction then is the opening up of texts to oppressed or hidden meanings. It says, that is what Derrida Derrida says it has no fixed meaning, language. It depends on the context. It depends on the community within which the language is used, the language game that takes place in that community. And as a true postmodernist, Jacques Derrida emphasizes plurality and difference. And then he plays on words in the French language, différence, which is difference, and différence. It's just one letter that is different, and the pronunciation is a little different in French. And différence, which means as much as postponement. There is never the moment when you really know what something means, that you're really ready with something. Jacques Derrida. He wrote, and this is one of his books, of grammatology. And I admit that I have not read it. I've looked at it, but it sounded very complicated to me. It's a philosophical evaluation of various philosophers with a special focus on the philosophy of language and applied to literary critical theory. But, and this is the sentence in yellow, in popular usage, the term deconstruction has come to mean a critical dismantling of tradition and traditional modes of thought. And it's in particular also in this way that I want to use it this morning. So a critical dismantling of tradition and traditional modes of thought. Some of the core ideas, I think that's important to mention, of the idea of deconstruction is the sentence that has become famous, statement made by Derrida, that there is nothing outside of the text. Now, there have been many questions about what Derrida actually meant, and it doesn't seem that everybody agrees on what he did mean, but there is agreement on the fact that he did not mean that there are no real tangible things outside of the text, that the text actually can refer to something beyond the text, even though he says there is nothing outside of the text. It is not pure idealism, only ideas and not any tangible reality. But what's important is that he says language is the filter, is the lens through which the world comes to us. We can only think about the world, can only talk about the world by the language that we use. And that is the language that I use and the language that you use, and that kind of language may actually be different because we do not always speak the same language. And when we read a text, there is always interpretation, because there is always a bias, there's always a presupposition, there are always certain, we always have our spectacles, our glasses through which we read, through which we understand. And therefore,
Angel, stop
the
it.
interpretations may be quite different because we have different glasses and we have different presuppositions. Not only that, but the text may be quite ambivalent. And we should remember that interpretation is not just our private interpretation, but there's also the aspect that it takes place within a community. And that, of course, is interesting, important for us as a Seventh-day Adventist community. The interpretation of things around us, the interpretation of what we read in the Bible, in some other places, that is influenced by the history of our community and by the community as it presents ourselves and maybe the sub-community in which we are. So these are some of the core ideas of deconstruction. I would like to emphasize that it means that if there is always interpretation, then meaning may shift, because the way we interpret something today may not be the same as how we interpreted, say, a year ago or a generation ago. Many of the books about deconstruction mention this particular example and say the shift of meaning in the text. Well, take a novel, and you read that novel 20 years ago, you read it now, and you may find that you react totally different to the content of that novel, and the meaning for you may shift considerably over time. That is what interpretation does for you. For Christians, it means that something happens like that when we read the Bible. When we read the Bible, it has a certain meaning for us. But when we reread that same Bible, that same section of the Bible, it may have a different meaning at a different stage in life. And the postmodern person is not worried by that, because that is in the nature of things. That is how it works. Well, let's take a very simple example here that I picked up from the internet. Texts may be very ambivalent. A very simple example here. This is a lift, drawing of a lift, escalator. What do you say? I think in Britain they say escalator, and in America lift, or is it the other way around?
Elevator.
Elevator, okay. Oh yeah, escalator is something else again. Okay. There is a sign on this door of the lift, seeing eye dogs only. Well, then you can see how words can be very ambivalent, can have a meaning that depends on your presuppositions, because what do these words mean? Seeing eye dogs only. Does that mean that all other animals are forbidden? That you cannot bring a cat into this elevator? Seeing dogs only. Does that mean that only those seeing dogs are allowed and not the people with them? And does that mean that a blind person may not be guided by a seeing person when it says seeing dogs only? And then, of course, there is the question, for whom is this sign? Because really, blind people cannot read it. Well, a very simple example that is given of how language can be ambivalent depending on how you read, when you read, and who reads it. Deconstruction is in a particular challenge for those of us who are Christians. Deconstruction and the Christian faith. Can deconstruction be reconciled with the Christian faith? Because if everything is interpretation, then is the gospel also mere interpretation, and is there no objective truth? That's a very important question for a Christian. But the answer that many have been given is, okay, everything may be interpretation, but are all interpretations of equal value? Are there maybe good interpretations and interpretations that are not so good? And true enough, interpretation always happens with certain presuppositions. But then it's all right, Christians are willing to acknowledge that they have a certain presupposition, and that they say that revelation informs their horizon. Having said that, Christians must at the same time also accept, at least that's what the postmodern person would say, the postmodern Christian would say, that even though revelation informs our horizon, yet we may not all think exactly the same, and we must also embrace a reality of pluralism. So deconstruction and the Christian faith. This is what John Caputo in his book, What Would Jesus Deconstruct, talks about. He's an emeritus professor at Syracuse University, a philosopher of religion. He is a liberal Catholic, has written several books on hermeneutics and postmodernism, and a number of books specifically on Jacques Derrida. And so there is this little book, it's only about 140 pages, What Would Jesus Deconstruct? And the subtitle, The Good News of Postmodernism for the Church. It's published in a series of the church and postmodern culture, and there are some very interesting other books in that particular series, and they are quite easy to read and very informative. So what would Jesus deconstruct? Caputo takes as his basis the famous slogan, what would Jesus do? And he refers to Pastor Charles Sheldon, who in 1896 wrote the book In His Steps, What Would Jesus Do? It is about, or it starts with a homeless man, comes to a church, has sought help in vain, enters the church, collapses. Very few people worry about him. He dies a few days later. And next day, the pastor, he holds a sermon, he preaches on the topic. In this case, what would Jesus have done? So that is the title of this book that gives the cue to Caputo. The book sold 30 million copies and gave rise to a whole What Would Jesus Do industry with all kinds of buttons and later t-shirts and what have you. What would Jesus do? And Caputo translates that into his question, what would Jesus deconstruct? And then he gives us a description of the essence of what he feels deconstruction means. And he applies it in particular not to written texts, but in particular also to organizations, to structures in the church. And that is, of course, what we are also interested in this morning. To deconstruct, he says, is on the one hand to analyze and criticize, but also on the other hand, and more importantly, to feel about for what is living and stirring within a thing. That is, feeling for the event that stirs within the deconstructible structure in order to release it, to give it a new life, a new being, a future. So he approaches it in a very positive way. He says it's not just to analyze, it's not just to pull things apart, but it's also to see what might be in there, what is living, what is stirring, what vitality is there left. And so how can we release that? And how can we then give that a new life, a new being, a future? So therefore, deconstruction is not negative. It never proceeds without love. Now he's talking about Christians deconstructing structures of the church. Deconstruction is not negative. It never proceeds without love. Deconstruction does not take a single step without love. It always follows in the steps of love, following love's call. What does it love? It loves the impossible, the indestructible, what is coming. And so I think it's important also that we always remember that if we criticize the church, events in the church, persons in the church, it is because we love our church. And there must be that positive fundamental attitude. And Caputo is pointing to that. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Well, when we go to take a step and say, do we find deconstruction in the Bible? And I would suggest that we find it in many different places. I've just taken a few examples. In the Old Testament, we find that the prophet Micah is involved in deconstruction. What did he deconstruct? He deconstructed religion that was based purely on rituals without inner commitment. You remember, you know, these famous texts in Micah 6. How shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Will God be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? O people, the Lord has told you what is good, and this is what he requires of you. So now Micah has done his deconstruction. He says what you must do, to do what is right, to love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. I believe this is a marvelous example of Old Testament deconstruction, going to the essence. And this is the kind of deconstruction that Caputo is talking about in his book as we look at the church structures, as the religious events and the religious customs of our days. The New Testament. What did Jesus deconstruct? Well, Jesus deconstructed a lot of things. And in your scripture reading, we heard about the Jewish leaders, and the point is well taken that this did not apply to all the Jewish leaders. And we find actually also in the book of Acts that as soon as the gospel is being preached after the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus Christ, there are many priests, there are many Jewish leaders that want to become members of the church. But there is a lot of superficial and self-focused religion, external religion among the Jewish leaders. And Jesus really deconstructed that. And the scripture reading that we heard is a very telling example of that. Jesus deconstructed the commerce that he saw in the temple, the way the holy precinct of the temple was being used. He deconstructed views concerning the Sabbath by healing people on the Sabbath, by going through the cornfield with his disciples, and by speaking about the Sabbath and telling the people that really the Sabbath was for men and not the other way around, and that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. In the Sermon on the Mount, where he repeatedly, and it goes on and on, he says, you have heard, and then he gives the traditional legal text. But I tell you, and he goes to the true meaning behind the text, the real meaning for everyday life. Another example of the many that we could give, principles of leadership. For the people in Jesus' days, even for the disciples, a leader was somebody who was bossing people around. Lordship, being in charge. Whereas for Jesus, leadership was service, servant leadership. What did Jesus deconstruct? There's a whole list of things that he did reconstruct. What did Paul deconstruct? To give another example from the New Testament, the idea that God's law no longer had any significance. Did he deconstruct that? No, he did not. The idea that obedience to the law is basic for salvation. Did he deconstruct that? Well, to some extent. The idea that the Jewish people no longer matter to God, he certainly deconstructed that idea in Romans 9-11. The idea that the Gentiles have replaced the people of Jewish descent as the real people of God. Well, I think he deconstructed that idea, and there are many Christians today who need to deconstruct that idea, also among Seventh-day Adventists. And Jesus deconstructed the approach of one shoe fits all. Paul was flexible in identifying with different audiences. So there are examples in the Bible of this deconstruction going on in the way that Caputo is mentioning. That brings us to questions as to what would Jesus deconstruct in Adventism. And I think that we can take some of this to our discussion in a few moments. What would Jesus deconstruct? There are some things that I think that need to be deconstructed, at least in many places in our church. And again, when we say this, that some things must be deconstructed, we must take the fundamental principle that Caputo has, that we do so from an attitude of love, not to tear our organization, our church, our community apart, but because we love our church, we care for our church, and see that these things come in the way of the kind of faith that Jesus intended us to have. Fundamentalism, it's still very much present in our church, and it's something that is unhealthy. It's something that we ought to get rid of. Officially, we are not fundamentalists, but in reality, a major percentage of our membership is fundamentalist. Legalism. In theory, we deny that we are legalists, but there are many ways in which we somehow even promote legalism. And one of the great challenges for the Seventh-day Adventist Church at the moment is the last generation theology, which has a major component of legalism. And that is something that we must try to deconstruct. Doctrinal rigidity, which puts too much emphasis on a corpus of doctrines, where every dot and every T must be crossed in exactly the same way. I believe, not everybody agrees, but I believe that is not a positive attitude. That does not help us to have a living faith. And that is something that I think Jesus would deconstruct if he were among us. Hierarchical thinking. George Knight calls that the Roman Catholic temptation. That is something that does not belong to a community where we are all priests and where we're all the same, have the same status before God. Male dominance. E.G. White as the final authority and arbitrator of what we should believe and how we should act. She is important. Nobody, that's not true, but at least I would not deny that she is important for us, plays a very important role, but not as the final authority on what I should believe and how I should act in the 21st century. What would Jesus deconstruct? He would also, I believe, deconstruct what I term remnant triumphalism. We sometimes have believed too much in this grand narrative of Seventh-day Adventism, and have promoted ourselves as the caring church and as the church that is really doing what we should be doing, the obedient remnant. But there are many good things, fortunately, that God is doing in our church, but there are also many things that we need to look at. And if Jesus were among us, he would counsel us to deconstruct them. Now, there is more that we could list perhaps, but these are some of the things that I think Jesus would deconstruct in Adventism today. Now, before we go to the question and answer period, and maybe this presentation is a little shorter than it should be, but just before we go to the question and answer period, and we have some questions and answers from last time, so maybe it's a good coincidence that we are a little shorter. The exercise in deconstruction. And here I'm going to two recent texts that are important for Seventh-day Adventism. And they were discussed and voted in the recent autumn council of our church in October last month. And voted, that was one of the documents, and I've taken some excerpt from this document, voted to adopt the statement, one humanity, the human relations statement addressing racism, casteism, tribalism, and ethnocentrism. And this statement wants to underline that as Seventh-day Adventists, we make no distinctions between human beings. Distinctions of race, ethnicity, caste, and tribe are used to sinfully segment and divide the fundamental unity God intended all human beings to experience with himself and each other. Now, if we are looking at the principle of deconstruction, we are not only looking at what it says, maybe the good things it says, but we also wonder now, what is it that it doesn't say? What is left out? And well, I think that most of us would immediately note that there is no mention of gender equality, and there is no mention of differences in sexual orientation. So even though this is a good statement in many ways, it comes, of course, in the context of what has been happening on the racial front in the United States. And even though we can be glad that our church reacted with a statement, and some of the things in this statement are very good, but when we deconstruct the statement and we look for what it doesn't say, then I would submit to you that this is a very serious omission. Is it incidental? I don't think so. But so that points us to a real problem that we have. Now, I'm sure that many of you would agree that we were all aware of that problem. But again, later in the statement, it says, we will support and nurture those marginalized and mistreated because of their color, caste, tribe, or ethnicity. So again, yes, of course, we want to support those who have been marginalized, mistreated because of their color of skin and because of their caste when you live in India, etc. Tribe when you live in Africa, or ethnicity. But what is missing is because of their gender or their sexual orientation. So when I read that statement, I thought this is a prime example, recent example of a text within our church that needs to be deconstructed. And I suppose when you read the whole text, then you will find some other things that you may want to look at critically. Another statement that was also voted at the recent annual council. It was not voted to adopt it, but it was voted to put it to the delegates of the 2021 General Conference session that is to be held in Indianapolis, in Indiana, in May 2021. So the delegates to that General Conference session are given that statement, and the intention is that the delegates there approve this statement. And it has to do with confidence in the prophetic guidance of the Seventh-day Adventist Church by means of Mrs. Ellen White. That's what it says, statement of confidence in the writings of Ellen G. White. Now, when we deconstruct this, then I would think that one of the first things that we might ask is, why is this statement necessary? Every 5 years, there is a similar statement. So is there a problem? And is this the way to address it? And does that mean that the problem is taken care of in this way? So why is it that we do this? It's become a tradition, but does it still have meaning? But then when we go into this statement a little further, it says, we believe that the writings of Ellen White were inspired by the Holy Spirit and are Christ-centered and Bible-based. Well, one could mean, what does that exactly mean? But then it says, rather than replacing scripture, they uplift its normative character, safeguard the church from every wind of doctrine. Now, this is a bit vaguer than the earlier version of that paragraph read. And I put the earlier version further down on this slide, because originally the text read, rather than replacing the Bible, they, that is the writings of Ellen White, uplift the normative character of scripture, and they correct inaccurate interpretations imposed upon it, derived from tradition, culture, mere human wisdom, and personal experience. Now, this is the version that was originally in the document. But before it was discussed and before it was voted upon by the people who were in the annual council, there was so much opposition to this that it was decided to change the wording before it would be put to a vote. And so this idea that it corrects inaccurate interpretations imposed upon it, so which makes Ellen White, in fact, the final arbiter of what a Bible text means, it was softened, and it says, rather than replacing scripture, the writings of Ellen White uplift its normative character, safeguard the church from every wind of doctrine, and offer an inspired guide to Bible passages without exhausting their meaning or preventing further study. They also help us to overcome the human tendency to accept from the Bible what we like and to distort or disregard what we do not like. Well, you can see that it is a very useful exercise to try to deconstruct and see what is happening here. It's not by coincidence that the earlier version was tried, but apparently, and I believe that's a good thing, there was too much opposition to put it that way. But I would still have some serious questions with regard to what is said, knowing also what the earlier version was. and what has been withdrawn. So these are two recent documents which, in my view, show that it is important not only to look at the structure of the church and see where deconstruction is needed and ask the question, what would Jesus deconstruct? But also looking at the texts, the documents that the church produces. So then, I hope that this has been helpful. And the final thought before we go to the questions is that how do I deconstruct my own thinking, my own commitments? Because it's, of course, worthwhile to look at the community to which I belong. But I should be willing to not only look at the community, but also look at my own thinking, the way I operate, the way I fit into that community. What would Jesus tell me to deconstruct? Thank you very much for listening to me. I'll try to stop sharing. Okay, I'll hand it over back to you, David.
Thank you, Reinder. Thank you so much. Two very different comments from me before we take a break. One of them is I could not help but think of Reinder growing up in a windmill. And from that windmill has come to the place where he is an intellectual leader that we see today. That's quite a journey, and I commend you for it. I also think the church probably expanded your horizons and made it possible for you to think of possibilities for your life that you might not otherwise have considered. And I think that's one of the benefits of the church. It makes the world seem bigger because we hear from other parts of the world. But in any case, from the windmill to deconstruction, that's quite a journey, and I commend you for it. The other comment is that this statement on one humanity, quote unquote, was discussed last weekend at the meetings of the Adventist Society for Religious Studies, and some who were there at the general conference when this was passed were present. And I must say they were not enthusiastically received by that group for this statement. They were personally affirmed, but not this statement. And the people on the panel had to respond in a way that I don't think is totally unreasonable. They said, well, you know, we said what you would want us to say, but we didn't have the votes.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the best we could get at this time with these people voting, but we will keep trying and see if we can do better next time. So sometimes people make an effort for things to change. Now, at some point, one will have to say to oneself, this has become so irredeemably corrupt or unjust, I must leave the denomination. Now, so if one does that, one just leaves an empty spot into which people more regressive will enter. So I don't disrespect people who leave, but I'm also thankful for those who stay and keep fighting the good fight as long as they possibly can. So now, go ahead, Reinder.
Well, I think that you actually did a little bit of further deconstruction by your comments about what happened during that meeting of the society. And I agree fully with you that leaving the organization of our church, that is something that I have never really considered. For one thing, that I know there is no organization, no church community that is perfect. I would find other things in other communities that probably Jesus would deconstruct, probably things that I would find issue with. So, and I agree with you that we all have a certain personal responsibility. If we think there are things that we should fight against, then, well, fight is maybe not the best word, because that has certain connotations that are unfavorable. But we should use the little influence that we have, then we must do so. And yes, at the same time, what Caputo says, that we should do so from a fundamental attitude of love for our church, and realizing that indeed, like you say, the church has also brought us much happiness and many opportunities.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Now I think it's about 11:30. So we will take a 10-minute break, and we will then begin with questions and comments. I see that George has his hand up, so maybe we should add George to the list. And anybody else who wants to be added to the list, please make your wishes known to Forrest during this time. So 10 minutes from now, approximately, we will reconvene. Thank you.
McKinley, are you on there?
Thanks, Forrest. No, I'm not on the list. I haven't decided.
No. I sent you a chat message.
Yes, I got
Okay.
the chat and I responded.
Okay, good enough. Just wanted to make sure you got it.
Thank you.
All right, and Danilo, I have you already from last week, so. I see Michael somewhere here today. You come down from Oregon? No. I don't need it right by me.
Reinder, can you hear me?
Yes.
Uh, Maybe you could explain at some point in time the difference between progressing to truth and deconstruction. I'm pretty sure there's a difference, but when I think about one who progressed to truth, my classic example of that would be Ellen White. Early on, she would say that when the General Conference is in session and when they rule and regulate on policy and procedure, that rule and regulation has come directly from God. And then when asked maybe 10, 15 years later whether she still believed that, she said, I've not believed that in a long time.
Mhm.
I'm thinking that's progressing to truth. And so I'm curious to hear from you the difference between progression to truth and deconstruction. Thank you.
All right. I'll ask Forrest whether the question and answer period has started and whether I should respond at this point to the question that has just been asked.
Let's do start. My suggestion is that we add Bud's question to the list. And it's a very good one. And
Yeah.
let's also note how warmly Bud is dressing. He must be where it's cold. So thank you, Bud, and we'll get your question going. We need to keep in mind, I think, these 7 things that we've heard about as challenges for our church: fundamentalism, legalism, including the last generation theology, doctrinal rigidity, hierarchical thinking, male dominance, Ellen White as the final authority, and remnant triumphalism. We can discuss anything we want, but I think it would be helpful to keep these 7 themes in mind. One more comment, and that is, we are sending out these notices about 9:45 a.m. If you don't receive one by, say, 9:55, please check your trash, because sometimes this goes to your spam, and therefore you'll find the notice there. We moved from AOL to Gmail and now to MailChimp to decrease this problem of spam, but it still happens now and then for some people. So if you don't get it, please check your trash, because it may have been sent there wrongly. All right, Forrest, over to you. I don't see Forrest. Where's Forrest?
I muted myself. So
Okay, there you go.
I am, okay. Okay, I want to go back to our list from last week. I'm going to start with Danilo. You're at bat, Danilo.
Thank you so much. Now, I have a little bit of a challenge with this subject, not because it's difficult to comment, but rather because it is particularly with my background, it is really difficult to know where to begin, because the issues are so broad and so far-ranging. If I was to first of all deal with just the issues as you have described, Dr. Bruinsma, both last week and this week, as confronting the church as such, I wouldn't necessarily need to call into consideration the issues of postmodernism versus modernism. I have seen issues in local grassroots churches by way of conflicts of various kinds that can be better described by the good old method of people who stray to the right or to the left. And as the Bible tells us, we've already been warned to avoid straying either to the right or to the left. And in most churches, most of the problems are basically from a relative minority of the people who have a penchant to go to one ditch or the other. So issues like you have raised have always been, and when I use the word always, I basically mean almost like a broken record, keep recurring. And it's because in our circles, in our communities, some restless souls are perpetually struggling for some form of control. And both those on the right and those on the left are struggling for control. And the biggest problem in a church is when you have some kind of power struggle. Because every problem that comes up, and in a number of occasions, I've fixed one problem, and before I could even breathe a sigh of relief that that one problem has been resolved, two others emerge. And then I am laboring to solve those. And no sooner are those solved, three more emerge. And after a while, I concluded, well, the problem is not the problem. The problem is, why are people having problems? You see, this becomes a bigger, deeper issue. And so in that context, the question of fundamentalism, legalism, doctrine, hierarchy, males, E.G. White, and triumphalism, I've been accused of every one of these. And I've also been accused of failing in every one of these. So working on the basic observation that if I tally up all the accusation on one side and all the ones on the other side, they will more or less conveniently cancel one another out. I've more or less left those things to the side. But as a scientist, the things about postmodernism that most trouble me are the following. The somewhat lax attitude to truth, even to the concept of truth, that itself is somehow flawed. Also, the next point is that there is an antagonism in postmodernism towards science, and not just towards knowledge. It's that the knowledge itself has no meaning. And then, of course, to go along with all of that, there is a deep-seated mistrust of rules as a whole. The rules are somehow considered as impediments to everything that ails us and the big source of all our troubles. Well, there is a quote I would like to share from Felix Frankfurter from 1962, Supreme Court judge in the United States. And he said the following: fragile as reason is, and limited as law is, as the expression of the institutionalized medium of reason, that is all we have standing between us and, on the one hand, the tyranny of mere will, or on the other hand, the cruelty of unbridled, undisciplined feeling. The
Wow,
problem
Danilo, that's powerful, powerful. I don't know how you can be more powerful than that. Did you want to finish up with a sentence or two?
Yes, the problem is that the postmodernism is an orchestrated, organized attempt to undermine every source of authority, every source of, how should I say, basis on which you could build something, whether it is truth, the authority of truth, that's no good. When I was a graduate student, they actually gave us essays titled The Tyranny of Truth. I thought that was about abuse of truth. No, they were talking about why should we be limited to having to actually demonstrate that what we're saying is true? We want to be able to say anything.
Okay, well, I think
This kind of stuff, postmodernist nonsense, makes it impossible to know anything. And in that sense, it is inherently inconsistent because it undercuts its own validity for having an argument.
Okay, there you go. Thank you, Danilo. One comment from me, then over to Reinder. I think we need to keep in mind that by definition, postmodernism is not one thing. We should not speak of postmodernism, but only postmodern-isms. And what you've said apply to some, perhaps, but not to others. But let's get, the other comment is, I want no one to feel frustrated for lack of time. This is a very important topic. We'll take the time we need to discuss it. So let's relax and explore these matters because they are very, very important. If we don't get it all done this week, we will continue to next. And we will, hopefully that Reinder can be with us, but if he can't, we will continue the discussion on our own. Okay, Dr. Bruinsma.
Well, next week, actually, I have promised to be in another Sabbath school class at the same time. So being human, it's difficult to be in two places at the very same time. Well, you know, where do I begin to answer this? Let me say that I hope that over the past couple of weeks, I have not given the idea that I endorse all the ideas of postmodernism. I think that some of the ideas of postmodernism are good correctives to some of the ideas of modernism. But of course, as Christians, certainly as Christians, there are, we must handle this very, very critically. Now, the issue of truth, and I think I've said that a couple of times, we cannot escape the issue of truth. But at the same time, postmodernism maybe has reminded us that we have called many things truth where it was our own opinion. And the emphasis on the fact that we do interpret truth, and we may interpret that differently, that is within certain limits, something that I think postmodernism is reminds us of that, and that is worthwhile. Now, you mentioned that modern and postmodern is actually equivalent to left and right. To some extent, of course, it is. Liberal, conservative, etc. But I think it goes further than that. There is a whole world of ideas that people either consciously or unconsciously have. And there is a large group of people, certainly in the Western world, that is operating by other ideas. And that it is important that we understand what those ideas are so that we can talk intelligently to one another. Otherwise, we are just not communicating. You mentioned some of these problems that I have listed. Maybe I could have listed some more, but yes, of course. You wonder where to begin. And I think we all do from time to time. At the same time, some of these issues that I mentioned are very much interconnected. Of course, fundamentalism and legalism is very much interconnected. And some of the other things, the issue of male dominance, very much interconnected with the issue of fundamentalism. But where we start in dealing with these things, in reacting to these things, it depends very much on where we are, the local community in which we operate, and well, also time and place. And it very much depends on what Caputo said, that we do so with a positive attitude, an attitude, it sounds almost too good to be true, but an attitude of love. Because after all, we want to build the church and make it more resemble the kind of community that God wants us to be. Now, yeah, what are the other things that, well, you criticize postmodernism for a number of things. They're, you know, how they deal with authority, with rules, with science, and let's see, the attitude towards truth. Yes, and I think I have mentioned these various things, but you know, we need to understand why so many people in the church have a problem with authority. Why, on the other hand, many people in the church abuse authority. It is part of the underlying different kind of worldviews that people have. And so I concur with your criticism of postmodernism to a large extent. At the same time, I realize that I have been heavily influenced by it and many others with me, and that others in the church have not had that same experience, and you started with saying, I have a different background. And so, you know, others may not have that same background that you and some others have. And we must try to understand what those backgrounds are, where we are coming from, and hopefully we can be some kind of a corrective to one another. Well, maybe that covers most of the things that you mentioned.
Thank you, Reinder. Let's go on. And Danilo, if you have another comment or question, let's put you at the bottom of the list and keep. We'll go through the others and then maybe come back to you. Thank you, Boris.
Okay, we have Eduardo from last week. Eduardo, está aquí?
Okay, thank you, Pastor Bruinsma. Let me start with the statements of 1 Corinthians 1:10. Now I beseech you, brethren, by the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, that you speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. When I was baptized about 37 years ago, in the teachings or doctrines, still today, they are teaching about jewelry. And I was coming from the Catholic tradition, which the wedding ring is not a big problem. Actually, is promoted. Then about 100 of my relatives came to the church after me, and all of them left the wedding ring out. About 2 years ago, I listened to Joe Cruz's sermon, and he mentioned that John, the Cardinal, John, I forgot his second last name, Newman, in his book declared that the wedding ring is a pagan tradition that came to the Catholic Church. As far as I know from the church manual and the teachings of Ellen G. White, it still remains that we should not wear a wedding ring. I think I read that it's only allowed in the countries where is trouble of fidelity, but not in America. She mentioned we Americans do not practice this custom.
We have trouble with infidelity here.
All right,
And-
thank you, Eduardo. Thank you. I think you've got a marvelous case study here. The wedding band is a case study in modernism, pre-modernism, modernism, and postmodernism. So this is a very, very focused issue, and let's see what Dr. Bruinsma has to say about it. And as you have noted in the past, we have noted in the past, the single most requested issue for back issues of Spectrum is the one on jewelry. It covers all the other issues more so than any of them. So jewelry is a very interesting issue, and let's hear how pre-modern, modern, and postmoderns might deal with it.
Well, I think you can see that I wear a wedding ring. And in my culture, it would be strange if I didn't. It would tell the people around me that I'm available for an adventure. Actually, and I don't know how much time we want to spend on this particular case study, but Ellen White lived in a particular time, in a particular culture, and approached it from a particular perspective. But when her daughter-in-law, who married Willie White, there was quite an age difference, and Ellen White said that in her case, when it was brought up, it would be wise to wear a wedding ring. So, well, I think many modern people would say, okay, we have this in the church manual, we have this in certain Ellen White statements. There is the traditional understanding that anything that we have around our fingers and everything that we might have on our ears, everything like that is jewelry. Well, the more postmodern person would say, what is the principle? And is it against Christian principles to look good, to have some adornment? Is it biblical? When we look at the Bible, what do we find? Did people wear jewelry? Is it a matter of taste also? Is it a matter of where we spend our money? There are numerous, a number, let's put it that, a number of principles involved that we need to apply. So, you know, I would wish that we could lay this issue to rest. And when you talk about division, this causes unnecessary division. But it is a prime example of where the difference is between one type of thinking and another type of thinking. In my country, here in the Netherlands, you will find churches where this is an issue. These are mostly people who have come from another culture, and this is what they have been taught, often by Western missionaries a century ago. And there are churches where this absolutely is a non-issue. So, you know, to me, it's an issue. It's a matter also of majoring in minors. And let's look at the principles rather than at the way some of these principles are applied from within a particular cultural perspective.
All right, that shows how these different worldviews approach an issue as concrete as wedding bands and wedding rings. Forrest, who's next?
Okay, we've got Peter. Peter, are you there? I saw you earlier. Oh, there you are. Okay, all right. Okay, Peter, to you.
Thank you, Dr. Bruinsma, for your presentation. I have a question in regard to your previous presentation, and after that, I have a comment related to today's presentation. But let me say also a few words about the problem that Eduardo raised here. When he mentioned that this is a pagan custom, the wedding ring. Yes, it's a pagan custom. It was initiated by the Romans that believed that there is a connection between the hand and the heart, and that this custom originated. And it's a pagan custom coming from the Romans. But if I recall correctly, in the statement that the General Conference put up, it explained that it's not a problem of jewelry, of pride, it's a problem of commitment, and it will prevent putting especially women in difficult situations. Now my question related to your previous presentation. You mentioned a few times that there is an increasing emphasis in the church for Adra and for Maranatha. And listening to this, I was wondering if this, if the church is not losing its focus on its real objective. Because when Jesus gave the commission to his disciples, he didn't say go into all the world and preach a gospel of prosperity, solving all the poverty and all the problems like that. He said, go into all the world and tell it, preach the good news that God has a plan to deal with the sin, a plan of redemption. And I think this should continue to remain the focus of our church and the Christianity in general. And of course, that doesn't mean that we should not be interested in taking care of the poor. The first church was, Apostle Paul was interested in this problem, but he first preached Christ and him crucified. And the cross, he said, is a stumbling block and a shame. But he continued to emphasize that. And I think this is what we should continue to emphasize. Because otherwise, we are going to transform the church in a kind of Salvation Army. And there is a Salvation Army already. We don't have to become another Salvation Army. And in other words, not to advocate using a phrase that was popular amongst those that were criticizing postmodernism, creating a religion without religion. What do you think, Dr. Bruinsma?
All right. Well, first of all, when you stated that something was a pagan custom, I would say, well, there are many things also in our religion that have a pagan origin.
Yes.
But, you know, I wouldn't worry unduly about that. Many of these things may have a pagan origin, but have lost that connotation and have a totally different kind of meaning. And that is, at least in my opinion, what counts. But as to your other question or comment, I mentioned organizations like ADRA and Maranatha, etc., as an illustration that the more postmodern inclined person in the church and many younger people are interested in a kind of Christianity, in a kind of faith that goes out to do something that is for the whole person. And I think it is wrong to put one kind of preaching in opposition to another kind of preaching, as if something is vertical and some other stuff is horizontal. True, Christ said, go into the world, preach, baptize. He did not say organize Sabbath schools, and yet we have done that. He did not say get publishing houses going, but there are many different ways in how we interpret and how we practice the distribution, the preaching of the gospel. It is clear from what Jesus did, how he preached and how he combined the vertical and the horizontal himself. And that should tell us something. And also, he tells us that when he comes, he wonders what we have done, where we have met people in his name and helped those people. So I think there is ample biblical evidence that prevents us from plotting the horizontal over and against the vertical. So when our preaching becomes only the work of the Salvation Army, actually, I would credit the Salvation Army to doing a bit more than just helping the homeless. And actually, there's lots of work which they cannot do that others might be willing to do. But it would be wrong for us to reduce our efforts in the world to humanitarian efforts. But it's just as wrong to only preach and do not show in what we do how we can help humanity. And you know, there is the living water, and that should be distributed. But then there are also wells that must be dug or drilled in places where they need water. And we need to do that as well. So yeah, don't plot them over against each other, but we must find creative ways of combining them in ways that are relevant for today's world. And we will find that that speaks also to a segment of our membership, which we might otherwise lose.
Well, as I mentioned, it didn't imply that the church should not take care of the poor and those in need. But my point was that the main emphasis should be on the gospel.
Well,
and that should be attached to it.
Whether we talk about main or less important, those are two components of Christian life, preaching and doing. And yes, if one takes over the other, then we miss the balance. And there is the example of Jesus Christ that we must continue to follow.
Okay, and the comment in relation with your today's presentation. I believe the main, in my view, the main problem with postmodernism is, to call it in one word, relativity. And because relativity is promoting skepticism and doubt.
Mm-hmm.
And that are serious problems that are creating even in Christianity. And I would say that the great historian Tacitus would agree with postmodernists that basically all major problems are full of ambiguity. And I was looking at what basically postmodernism is, what the problems postmodernism is creating. And especially in regard to the main domain of knowledge. Well, basically, they have serious problems with the science and reason, and consider that basically science and reason is not capable to give us the whole truth. And the church, the Christianity, agrees with that because science and reason are not sufficient. And of course, theology, it's important, religion, it's important. The second domain of knowledge is philosophy. And basically, postmodernists believe that it's not possible to know the whole truth, and the truth is not objective. And of course, we don't agree with that. I mean, Christianity doesn't agree with that because no matter how you try to get around that Jesus is the truth, you cannot do it. You can try to go to say it softly or strongly or whatever, but the truth that we believe in, Christianity believes in, is Jesus is the truth. There's
All right.
no other way around, even if it's hurting some people.
Okay, Jesus is the truth. That's a good, so we have relativity on one hand and Jesus is the truth on the other hand. Let's get some response from Reinder.
I didn't finish, David.
Hurry up.
Okay, I'm trying to hurry up as much as I can.
Okay.
Postmodernists are attacking communication. And if we go to Jacques Derrida, that he said his main saying was that there is nothing outside of the text. Well, if we take this stricto sensus, that will help the church. If we look at the text and say, well, this is what the text, this is what the story of Jesus is telling, and we should look at it and understand the way it is. But from your presentation, and I know that postmodernists try to get around this, and there is more than one meaning to the word, and that is creating problems with the communication, with the meaning. And they believe that basically there are no facts, just interpretations. And the last domain of knowledge is morality, that they were also considering subjective, and it's a cultural creation, is not an absolute given, transcendentally given by God. I will stop
Okay,
here.
we have here science, truth, philosophy, ethics. At least 4 realms, maybe another one. Let's get Dr. Bruinsma to respond to this.
Yes, well, some of these questions and comments are quite long, so I kind of have to be careful not to lose track of them. But I'll try to answer as best as I can and as succinctly as I can. You mentioned relativity as a problem of postmodernism, and surely that is also what I have indicated earlier, that there is this problem of relativity. And that is where a Christian would disagree, that not everything is relative. But it is good that we are sometimes reminded that some things that we consider to be absolutely sure are in fact quite relative and of relative importance. So there is a corrective that needs to be made to postmodernism. But postmodernism also reminds us that there is more relative often than we accept, or the modern person would accept. Now, you said that postmodernism creates this and creates this and creates this. Actually, it doesn't. Postmodernism registers what is happening and describes what is happening, rather than being a causal factor in what is happening, at least not in the first instance. Does postmodernism create doubt? Probably in the minds of some. But for many who doubt, it is actually helpful to realize that their doubt is because they have gradually become a more or less postmodern person. And knowing that helps them to know where they stand and to think through some of the things that they doubt. And I would argue that, and that's a topic in itself, but that doubt is the other side of faith, and that doubt in itself is not sinful. A doubt, we must deal with it, yes. And, you know, some people never ask the difficult questions and will never doubt. Other people ask the difficult questions without trying to solve them, at least some of them. And I think there is a middle road of dealing with doubt and actually trying to work through your doubt and to have the grace to make a leap of faith when necessary. What else did I miss? Truth? Yes, Christians will maintain that there is truth. There is truth, as David says, in Jesus Christ. What I believe about Jesus Christ is not necessarily truth. And I have changed many of my ideas, and so probably have you over time, about various doctrines and about Jesus Christ and about how God is. So there is, postmodernism tells us, and we have discussed that in particular this morning, there is this element of interpretation. But as I mentioned, and that is also what this Caputo mentioned, it does not mean that all interpretations are equally valuable. And that is where we talk about this horizon of revelation, which is helpful or is a requirement for us to know that we find truth, we look for truth in Jesus Christ. And when he says, I am the truth, he is in course in particular referring to a personal relationship that we have with him rather than only intellectual knowledge. Well, I hope I have done some justice to what you said and what you asked. I've tried to anyway.
Thank you for trying.
Okay.
Okay, David, I have Jeff. You had your hand up last week. Was that, did you have something you wanted to add today?
Yeah, well, this is Jeff Kale. I don't know how many Jeffs there are.
You're the Jeff I'm talking about. Your hand was up.
It was a Donna question, but she is satisfied, so.
Okay, all
you can
right.
keep my name off the list, okay?
All right, just I'm checking my list, checking it twice.
Yeah.
So, okay, all right.
A good Santa Claus, yeah.
Okay, I got to go to Dr. Tishi now.
There's no
George?
Dr. Tishi. There's only George here. There's no Dr. Tishi.
Well, that's what you had on this morning.
First thing was a mistake. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Brainsma, for this great
Well,
presentation.
there's no Dr. Bruinsma here. There's only Reinder here. Yes.
Right there.
Okay.
Thank you. That is funny. Yeah. Well, when I hear about rings, you know, wedding rings and all this, I wonder because I love potatoes, and I wonder if the pagans loved potatoes too, and for this reason I should stop eating potatoes. I'm always amazed at the level of thinking about this thing, you know, the jewelry and all these things. It's just so laughable to me. But my point is more toward the LGT that you mentioned, because through the history of our church, the heresy of perfectionism, many people have attempted to infiltrate this heresy in our ranks, and unsuccessfully so for a long time. But now they changed the name for a fancy name, LGT, and last generation theology. My concern is that, just as a question here, because on the AC annual council in 2018, on Sabbath morning, the president of the GC clearly declared that he believes in LGT. It's there documented. What would be your concern in terms of the future of our church? What, especially now that the LGT made it actually to the top of the administrative tree.
All right. Well, when it comes to potatoes, I must say that I'm a lover of potatoes. And for me, every day without potatoes is a lost day. But when it comes to last generation theology, I think it is a worldwide plague. And it is based on a number of things, but it is significant that there are very few, let's say, trained theologians in our church who support LGT. But it's mainly supported by others, and others at the fringe of the church, and in particular also by a number of independent ministries. Now, the fact is that the president of the General Conference is actually not a trained theologian. And that is clear in many ways. And he has gone on record that he never reads anything else but Spirit of Prophecy and Bible. And so that's a bit scary, you know, when you hear that of your leaders. But the president is very careful not to use the term last generation theology. But, and to my knowledge, he has avoided that. But there are instances, certainly in his major sermons, where he is clearly enunciating the principles of last generation theology. Last generation theology is based on a very selective reading of Ellen White's statements, and then finding some Bible texts that seem to support that particular train of thought. Much has to do with the issue of the nature of Jesus Christ, his human nature. And there are numerous statements made by Ellen White, but you can actually defend different positions by using those statements. But if you make a careful study, then you would find that certainly towards the end of her life, she would not defend the post-fall human nature of Jesus Christ. And she says that we should not make Christ altogether like us, for that cannot be. There is this issue of Christology. A basic issue, I think, is also that there is a very shallow understanding of what sin is. And when you have that shallow understanding of sin, you can reach for perfection, because then you just cross off the things that you either need to do or should leave. And so there are a number of other basic fallacies in last generation theology. The worst is it makes many, many people very unhappy. And I would be more inclined to believe in the theory of LGT if they could show me one person who has actually reached that level of perfection that supposedly Jesus Christ is looking for before he can come back. So I hope that, you know, there will be some changes in the church and that we will have more people who have the willingness and the expertise to deconstruct this fallacy of last generation theology.
Thank you. I really appreciate. On Spectrum, we had several or hundreds of discussions about LGT, and I have been always using this argument: show me one person, and then that reached the goal, and then we talk about it again. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Reinder.
Excellent, George.
Okay, I now have Edwin Racine. Edwin? Whoops, are you there, bud?
Yeah, I think I asked the question earlier. Maybe I jumped the gun on it.
It's okay.
Have Reinder talk about the difference between progressing to truth and deconstruction.
Okay. Actually, I'm not sure what to answer because to a large extent, they probably overlap. Maybe deconstruction is a bit more intentional in well, trying to find out what we read in texts and what we do not read, what is not there, whereas progression may be a little bit more of a natural development in our lives as the result of what we experience, what we read, what we talk about, what we think. So there may be that kind of difference, but I think the two are good. With progressing, of course, progression is something that takes time. It's not something that you can sit down to do. And when we talk about progression, we need to keep in mind that we all progress at our own speed, at our own, at our own speed. And it's sometimes very difficult for people, for most of us probably, that when we have progressed to a certain point and we have taken 25 years to do so, that we then talk to people, explain our point of view, and wonder why they cannot progress to that same viewpoint in just a matter of hours. But they are certainly connected, progression and deconstruction.
Thank you.
Thank you. By the way, I apologize for that noise. It was at my location a little while ago. My dog and my cat had a discussion and they weren't agreeing on the topic. So anyway, let's see, I've got Terrence Dunder now. Terrence?
First of all, Reinder, those have been fantastic presentations, by the way. I've really appreciated them. Obviously, whenever we get into this discussion of deconstructing, people tend to go to the how many angels sit on the head of a pin, usually. And I think it presents us with a unique opportunity, really, because it is only in the doubts that have been generated through knowledge, and knowledge has increased, that we have reached this point of postmodernism, or maybe it's called modernism now. But you mentioned that one of the things when we enter into deconstruction that must be maintained is this spirit of love. And I see that there are underneath of that actually 4 major characteristics that must be maintained in order to be congruent with a foundation of love. And those would be freedom, diversity, justice, and equality. Do you know, just respond if you feel that there are any others that could be or should be added to a list of preconditions as we look at the opportunity modernism provides for us to really create a foundation that is firm.
Yeah, well, I think you have actually given a pretty good description of the kind of love that we need, because it needs providing others with space when we demand space for ourselves. It demands tolerance, and I suppose it also can mean moderation. You know, when you want to be a leader and when you want to have the church go in a certain direction, of course, and this can be at any level, you can try to go so quickly that nobody can see you anymore, and you lose any kind of following. So space, yes, freedom, tolerance, respect in particular also. And that is, which I think is often missing. Also, when we make the decision, the division between liberals and conservatives, you know, many of the liberals, so-called, treat conservatives as if they are more or less idiots. They do not see things clearly because they have their eyes closed or they live in a different kind, whatever. And many of the conservatives think that these liberals have no faith at all and they are really not loyal to the church, etc., etc. So that hinders a lot of discussion because there is the sense there is not that mutual respect. And I think that's also part of that love. But it's important that we do have that fundamental attitude that we want to serve the church, we want to help others, and we realize that we may be wrong ourselves from time to time. You know, when I was in a position of leadership here in the church in the Netherlands, there were some particularly nasty people. And I really had problems relating to them. And then one day, one of my colleagues said, you know, I realize that, you know, these people give you a difficult time, but always remember, they also love their church. And that was very good counsel. So I don't have to agree with everybody, but I have to assume that we all want that what is good for the faith community to which we belong. And we need to respect one another. But then at the same time, if we have certain convictions, we need to find ways of, well, exerting our influence. That's more or less what I would answer.
Okay, I could obviously follow up with many questions. It would be lovely to sit down for an hour and talk, but thank you again.
Forrest, who's next?
I'm sorry, Rodney Corker.
Reinder, I think there's an inherent and manifest weakness in the reconstruction model. And so my question is, why does it seem to be so difficult for people, even scholars, to move from deconstruction to reconstruction. And I want to give you 3 thoughts as to why I think that the model fails in some situations, and then finish with an observation. I think the first thing is that deconstruction is not an outcome. The outcome that we're looking for is reconstruction. And so I continually find myself looking for the reconstruction and finding myself back on the deconstruction. I think the second thing is that there are people, and maybe some of the younger people haven't got it clear in their mind, that postmodernism, the word is deconstruction, and they translate that into destruction, extinguishing, annihilating, and you've warned against that. So I really like Caputo, and I really like Bruinsma. But there are people that are postmodernists that talk about extinguishing, and what they're really doing is taking and removing the tools that are necessary to move forward, and they eliminate a stable platform, any kind of foundation, you know, which is necessary to build on. The concept of stability is very important, and predictability is very important. So this confusion in some people's mind between deconstructing and destruction, I think there's an element in there. The third observation is what really will work, what works and what doesn't work. I spent around 25 years in corporate America trying to move large organizations where they wanted to go, and at no time did we ever deploy a deconstruction and reconstruction model. It didn't enter into the way that American institutions move their businesses forward. So our language was very much around a vision building, mission building, values, goals, objectives, needs assessment, and that needs assessment obviously had to be community sensitive to different needs, but it was very comprehensive, and people would spend a lot of money going down this road, but we didn't deconstruct and reconstruct. There are other models such as that we use, such as demonstration models, the consumer demand model, which I think Roy Branson Legacy Fellowship model is a consumer demand model, because we put our feet in our faces and our money with what speaks to us. Another model is various demonstration sites that can be observed and monitored. These are the American ways of moving corporations forward, if those corporations have a sense of where they want to go. It's a process more towards reconstruction and not deconstruction. So I have an observation here after 3 years in the Branson Fellowship, which I just enjoy immensely. And we have numerous presenters, they're scholars and writers, authors, and philosophers. And they often will do a presentation on what the church should do. We know many of these things. For example, the 28 beliefs. The issue is, where do we start and how do we start, and who is going to do the start? I have heard many presentations on the 28 beliefs that they should be prioritized, for example. Okay, from my point of view, that's where I would like to start. And I've done that, but I've never seen a presentation yet, David, where someone has had the strength or whatever to say, I'm going to make a start, I'm going to prioritize them, categorize them. This is what comes first, this is what comes second, this is what comes third, whatever. So for me to finish with, I say, I'm an impatient person. I decided to proceed myself. So for 3 years, I have a notebook and I have headers that say, I believe. And underneath, every time I hear somebody say something that resonates with me, I write down, I believe. And I've compiled this into a little booklet of my own belief statement. I'm not going to wait on the church. I'm not going to wait on other people. I'm going to take ownership of this, have my own beliefs. And I want to tell you, it's so freeing and so exhilarating. I'd encourage anyone to do it. Just start with, I believe, and listen and learn.
All right. I think your comment is very valuable in that when deconstruction stops at trying to point at things that are wrong, things that must be changed or eliminated, then we miss the point. Mm-hmm. And that is something that also this Mr. Caputo very strongly emphasizes that when we do so, we should also look for the things that are good, that have the potential of creating a new vitality, etc., etc. So, yes, deconstruction and reconstruction must go together. I fully agree with that. I don't know. You suppose know there is a book that I recently read partially that has to do with some leadership theories, and it's called Appreciative Inquiry. And I felt that without being religious, that is really a very good approach. That's something that could be used in a religious setting, and certainly in a local church setting, when you try to determine by interviewing the people and by going a bit into history. Now, not only what went wrong, but what was considered to be a success, what was considered to be a blessing, what is something that we have lost and that we must regain. And there were some techniques in that book that I felt would be a very helpful thing in the process of this deconstruction, reconstruction. And yes, prioritizing. Now, I have done that in this book, Facing Doubt. There is actually a chapter at the end where I say, okay, what is important for my faith? That is not determined in Silver Spring, but that is what I must find out. And then there are things that are more important than other things. So I have tried to kind of classify those beliefs. There are some basic Christian issues that are non-negotiable. There are a few, but not many, basic Adventist issues that are not negotiable as long as I want to be a Seventh-day Adventist, want to call my dad. Then there are some issues that are on a different level of importance. And there we can have different views maybe. And then there are issues that are more of a custom rather than a belief. The problem is that we often confuse these different categories, and that something like a custom, you know, like the famous wedding ring, becomes something of a fundamental belief. So I fully agree with that. That is, we must own our statement of belief and do so, you know, intelligently, and try to find out. And your subdivision may be different from mine. That is fine, because, you know, there are borderline cases, but it is important to realize that not things are equally important. Now, that is not relativism, but that is, I think, something that, in fact, the Christian church has always done. And actually, our pioneers, they talked about the pillars of our faith. And then they mentioned a few things, not everything.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, okay, I would be interested to see your list.
I will send it sometime. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, David, I don't have any new. I have the two that have already spoken. I don't know, looking at our time, what you want to do. So give me count.
Maybe we'll conclude here. I think this is a good concluding place. Now Matthew Cortman will pick it up here next week, and he will deal with many of the issues that have come up. And that's why there is this additional school of thought called meta-modernism, which tries to address some of these things. Now, here's a thought. What if Isaac Newton is modernism and Einstein is postmodernism? laws on the one hand and relativity on the other. That's one way people in the philosophy of science deal with this issue. But there are other ways there as well. Now, let's be sure that Dr. Bruinsma and his wife understand how much we appreciate what they've done. We will have them back. When he's writing a new book, we'll get that new book before us and we will discuss it. So this is not forever farewell, but I'm going to turn this over to gallery view, and when I get there, let's see if we can all give them a round of applause. Here we go. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Yes.
It's been,
go ahead.
It's been a pleasure and a privilege. And I hope that I have not given the impression that I'm a die-in-the-wool postmodernism who looks down upon all the people who consider themselves modernists. But thank you for having me. And I've come to know some of you personally during visits at Loma Linda. And I've seen now some of you whom I do not recollect seeing, but I hope that I'll have an opportunity to come back. My new book is almost finished.
1 second. Have we lost? Am I the only one who's lost Reinder?
No,
No.
you're not.
Let's what can we do about that? Okay, let's try again, Reinder. We were losing you a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Good.
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm saying that I look forward to indeed in the future at some time being with the group again. And my new book is in the process of being finished. It's about the second coming and some of the questions that we as Seventh-day Adventists have and that we need to look at again. I hope that the travel restrictions will also be lifted again and that it will be possible for Afi and myself to, in the not too distant future, again make a trip to Southern California. And if so, we would like to do that in the winter when it's winter here, because it's always attractive to leave the place here when it's freezing. So thank you very much for having me, for inviting me, and for the pleasant way of interacting. And God bless you all.
Thank you. Here's our benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
No. I wanted to see which title we have.
David,
Yes.
this is Ruth Christensen, and I'd like to be sure I get on your list.
Okay.
I've got a pen and paper.
Okay.
My email is ruthchristensen@yahoo.com.
Okay. All little letters, Ruth?
All little letters, and the Christensen is T-E-N-S-E-N.
Okay.
For Christensen. C-H-R-I-S-T-E-N-S-E-N.
At Yahoo, you said?
At yahoo.com. Mm-hmm.
Have you not been on our list before?
That's correct. I was here last week.
Okay. Okay. Just making
sure. But I didn't get my
because
name on. And so I've had to have several people help me get on.
Oh, okay, okay. We'll make sure we add you.
Thank you very much.
Because I just got a request from someone else to add his parents, and I'd already done that several weeks ago. So I think sometimes this is going to spam.
Okay, well, both.
I will forward you today the one from this week so that you have the email address, and then we'll add you to the list this weekend.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome, Ruth.
Okay.
John says
We'd like to be added to the list also.
you're on the list.
Dr. Reiswig, you're not getting the notices, is that correct?
We put you on the list.
Are you?
No, I haven't been getting the notices.
Have you
Okay.
checked your spam?
No.
Sometimes they go to trash.
Okay.
So
Okay.
check there, and we'll double check. Tell me what your email address is, and we'll double check that it's on the list.
Salmon Creek Medical.
Oh. That's why
I don't think I've seen that before. That's a good
No.
one. I like it.
Yeah. Salmon Creek Medical.
At gci.net.
They may have one.
Oh, and-
Sorry, I gave Bronwyn entrance point at gci.net.
Well, that's my wife's email. What you can use Suzanne also for that.
Because I'm pretty sure we added the entrance PT at gci.net, because that looks very familiar to me
Yeah,
several weeks ago.
I think that probably is right, but I was on mine today, and so I didn't see it.
Okay. Well, we'll send it to both of them.
Okay, great.
What is John Reiswig, right?
Yes.
Two John Reiswigs, father and son.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, Dr. Reiswig, the father, is a friend of my uncle Joe Reeder.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's true.
That's
Yeah.
right.
He's over in the Pioneer Home now in Sitka.
That's right. That's kind of a
Yeah.
sad situation, but he had many good years with you and others there.
Yeah, I wish I could speak to him once again because I had my genetics done and I find out that I'm not half Norwegian like I thought. He was half Swedish, and he always would tell me the Norwegian jokes, and I would just turn them around. But I got my genetics done. I found out that I'm as much Swedish as I am Norwegian, so I can't figure that out.
Oh my.
Plus German like he was.
Yeah. His mother, my grandmother, was very sensitive to the issue between Swedish and Norwegian. You know, in subsequent generations, that sort of fades, but at one time that really mattered.
Well, you know, he was brought into the Norwegian fold on that Herzegovina trip, you know, where they went on the ferry up the west coast of Norway.
Okay. All right.
They brought him into the Norwegian fold.
Okay.
Because he grew up in Petersburg, which had a lot of Norwegians.
Yeah. And Russians.
I have a question before you turn us off, Dave. The entrance PT at gci.net, in whose name is that one?
That's Suzanne Reiswig's name.
Suzanne.
Yeah.
Okay. Because we like to put the names with them so we know who we're sending them to. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, Mom and Dad.
Bye.
Bye.
Do you like my background?
I do, yeah.
I actually got it going.